Summary report, change place, we're still got another work session on Chokecherry. Thanks for being here. The tape's on.
Christopher, Constant, Weddleton,
Green,
Forrest Dunbar. Do we have copies of the ordinance?
I got a copy.
It's before you.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
I don't have a copy, actually.
It's right behind your agenda.
Eric, you want to identify yourself in the record? So,
Eric Croft Assembly.
thanks for being here. What we've got in front of us is a proposed ordinance on Chokecherry. First, I'll turn it over to you. It's your ordinance.
Sure. Thank you. So, I don't know if we should call it choke cherries or bird cherries. There's or maydays. We've got a couple of different species actually here. Everybody has the ordinance in front of them. So I've also given you and I apologize I didn't get used to this sooner. I got you a very brief article that was in the the ADN yesterday that describes this invasive species. I also have a document here that my aide put together. She called all the nurseries and the box stores and tried to see, if we forbid the sale of these items or these species, is it going to, really harm some of our local businesses? And basically, she found that there's very few of these still in stock. That they basically have already sold their supply for the year. So this would probably be a good time if we were going to do this. It would have less of an impact than it might otherwise have on these businesses. I think there are some people here from the community that can speak to the sort of biological reasons for this a little bit better than I can. I hope some of them will be willing to testify. This was an issue that was brought to my attention when we were debating the pesticide ordinance. So, we banned the use of this pesticide, and there were people who were actually sort of in the weed removal and invasive species removal industry, and they came to me and said, that's all well and good, but we have problems with these things, and these are particularly damaging species. Now, this is by no means a silver bullet. I mean, this doesn't remove. We have tons of these things throughout town, on private property, on public property. We actually, I believe, maintain and water some of them on at the Town Square Park, on the park strip. There are a number of places where we maintain these species, but we have long since stopped putting more in. And if we had the money, and I think Josh could speak to this. Josh, are you here?
Yeah.
Josh, do you want to come forward? I think we would, in a perfect world, if we had the money to do it, we would remove these things from public land and replace them with some kind of native species. We probably would even try to maybe offer a buyback program or something to try to get people to stop planting these because they really are harmful. But I've always been drawn to the phrase, when you find yourself in a hole, the first thing you do is you stop digging. And that's sort of, I think, what we're doing here by stopping the increased supply and flow of these things into our city. That's the first step in eventually getting this invasive species under control. So that's all I have to say. I don't know, could we have Josh speak and then maybe meet members of the community? Yeah.
Is anybody on the phone?
It's feedback.
Nobody. Go ahead, Lynn.
So Josh Duran, Park Superintendent. Agree with what Forrest had to say. We do see this as an initial step in this larger problem that does exist. And I'll let experts speak to more how this impacts our natural spaces here in Anchorage and how it potentially impacts other natural spaces as it stems from Anchorage. We do see this as a very significant undertaking if this is truly something that we intend to eradicate area-wide, especially with now the addition of a chokecherry species into it, because that is also a very popular species that has other cultivars that exist with underneath it, so that it's even a broader spectrum of plants that exist both in our parks, our right-of-ways, our private residences, community facilities that exist all around town. But we are very well aware of how these species impact our riparian areas, our natural spaces that specifically exist within our creek corridors, such as Campbell Creek, Chester Creek, etc.
No, I'd like to have any experts might want to speak to the sort of biology of this. Is there anyone who'd be willing to talk to it? Yes, please. Can you please come forward and identify yourself?
Where should I stand?
Sit.
Okay.
Wherever you want, just sit.
I'm Gino Graziano. I work with AF and the Cooperative Extension Service, and I specialize.
Could you turn that down?
I specialize in invasive plants education and also research and dealing with this European bird cherry, Prunus patus and virginiana over the several years. And I've been to a lot of the community council meetings. I'll start with that Tim Stallard goes to basically ask permission to start managing these within their areas, within the parks that are in their areas. And one of the common themes that we always hear from those folks is so what about them being sold at big box stores and everywhere else? How can we really do that? So I applaud this measure on behalf of them because they're all supportive of that management. And this would definitely be a step in that direction of helping that management out. With regards to the biology, it was quite a while ago, probably 10, 12 years ago, biologists started noticing this out in the forest in fairly large numbers. And originally, we really just saw that it was in large numbers, and where it was, there wasn't much else growing. The forest understories no longer had dogwood, cranberries, ferns, etc. It was basically a different lit forest understory layer that was just these chokecherry trees. Later, a graduate student has done a assessment of impacts to salmon, looking at how these high density areas and might impact the forage available for salmon, salmon fry, rearing salmon in the streams, the insects, and what that student found was that the trees don't provide the same number and diversity of terrestrial insects to the streams that native species do. And those terrestrial insects make up a fairly significant portion of the salmon diet when they're rearing. Later, I think 2010, 2011, we were all fairly surprised when Fish and Game put out a press release and an article about the three moose that had died from eating this tree. And we had planted it, and even UAF had promoted it for years because moose typically don't eat it. And so it makes it a great landscaping plant, right? Great to put against your roads. And the reason they don't is because it has some cyanide toxicity to it. Typically, that's not going to kill a free-ranging animal, but what it does do, occasionally it will lead to a death. But what it really does is gives that tree a really big advantage over our other native species. And I've done quite a bit of work looking at how moose browse forests and how they browse forests, the trees that they prefer to eat in relation to the density of these chokecherry trees, and it is significantly different. They go after their willows and aspen and other trees that they prefer to eat more heavily and damage them more in the presence of these chokecherry trees. So it has the advantage over those other trees. It has the ability to diminish resources that are available to people, whether that's berries, ferns that they're foraging for in the forest, or just our ability to sustain a good moose population into the future.
Any questions from assembly members? John?
Come on, I think it's odd, I have a huge chokecherry in my backyard. It's actually very cool.
Have you tried to poison moose or something?
They seem to really like my backyard, not in the middle of this dense neighborhood. But I've been kind of just reading about this recently, and then this comes out, so it's kind of interesting. But I think we have some bans on certain kinds of like grass and so on, plant that it doesn't have invasives and things like that. I don't know this for a fact, but my impression is that we do, and that it's not followed by various stores selling grasses and so on. Is that true, or can we do this and it's not followed?
So I wonder if Jessica might want to speak to that. I mean, you did some research into the state invasive species ban, right?
The state of Alaska has an invasive species list. They call it noxious weeds. And there's actually a two-tiered approach. The first tier is plants that are banned. The second tier are the maximums of seeds per 100 seeds, so a maximum of 20 seeds per that are banned. The chokecherry is not identified on the state of Alaska list. And it's been pointed out to me by other experts, and I've confirmed it, that the state of Alaska hasn't updated their list in about 6 years. So while the chokecherry has appeared in other lists since then, it's not on the statewide list. And I don't know of any list at the municipal level banning the sale of chokecherries or any other plants.
Okay, it wasn't not specifically on chokecherry, but so the state has a ban on this. But my understanding is I can go to Lowe's and get grass seed that doesn't meet it in any way, shape, or form, and it's they ignore the community. Is that correct, or is there some enforcement mechanism?
You could probably speak to that better.
Yeah, through the chair, those state lists, any seed that comes into the state is actually required to be inspected by federal laws, and goes then identifies what seeds are in there. So that should be basically fixed at that level. And I haven't heard of anybody actually being able to go out and buy, physically go out and buy a noxious weed seed. Like you can't go buy Canada thistle or any of the grass species that are on the prohibited list. The restricted list you could technically go buy, and that would be legal. There are contaminants that make their way through. We do regularly get notifications from people, or we send those on to the Division of Ag about restricted or prohibited noxious weeds that find their way usually into long-lived woody ornamentals that are being sold. They're from somewhere else, and there's seeds in their soil, and if that grower down south wasn't managing their weeds, then those make it up. The Division of Ag responds to those requests, though, from people, those notifications, and actually will quarantine that lot of products. So,
Thanks.
Chris?
Yeah, Josh, can you speak briefly to what you mentioned, Tim Stollard, and that work, and maybe what we fund with that, how we fund it?
So, to this date, very few municipal dollars have actually gone to assist with the eradication of bird cherry as well as others. But we do recognize the problem, and admittedly so, it becomes, at least through my lens, somewhat sensitive because of what you mentioned, Forrest. We have very formal controlled spaces where we celebrate, prune, and water these species, but then at the same time we're realizing in these natural spaces the impact that these things are happening. So I think because of that, that has almost limited some of our efforts as it relates to this, and most of our efforts to this date have been through, albeit very large volunteer events that are we have assistance from Gino as well as Tim Stollard, and they utilize federal dollars to support the nonprofits that they run and function. And we, for the most part, from a staff perspective or municipal dollars perspective, we'll have our volunteer coordinator help organize these events and support it through that. But as it relates to municipal dollars going towards the eradication of these species, very, very little has happened. And I think for us to feel more comfortable doing that, we would like to work with experts in this field to come up with a strategic plan that defines an end game of how we get there. And without knowing that strategy of how we get there, it seems irresponsible to put a lot of effort towards it.
So, just with follow on, I have watched him at work for years now,
Yeah.
coming and going to community councils and doing education. I had always assumed he was municipal, so he's not.
No, he works under the Anchorage Park Foundation umbrella, and the Park Foundation is a nonprofit that has federal dollars that come in for this specific effort to fund his efforts.
So if we were to look more broadly, not just at municipal dollars, but at the Parks Foundation, which most of us spent 25 minutes in our last meeting listening about.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I had 5 minutes, it went a little long.
Right. So we know that this is an important municipal resource, if you will, and I would just suggest that we are already spending, although not our own general fund dollars,
Sure.
substantial resources in mitigating this problem in our parks and neighborhoods.
Josh, a question for you. We can pass this. What's to stop somebody from getting on the internet ordering a May tree anyway? Because I order apple trees all the time. I get them direct from the East Coast. What's to stop me from getting bird cherry trees?
And valid question, what's to stop you from going to the valley and purchasing it? Again, I see this ordinance as an initial step towards this, that moves towards something else. And you might be able to speak, so if the state of Alaska did adopt this as a noxious species, would that help limit? So potentially, the state of Alaska could get on board with this, and I imagine they have every intent to, would be my guess.
And that struggle of being able to purchase those things online especially is something that even the U.S. federal government struggles with their federal noxious weeds, particularly like aquarium species and things like that. Because there's internet trade, and you can go on there and buy Brazilian waterweed for your aquarium, and then so if you don't know any better, you might dump it in a lake. So, but this is a great step.
Okay. Morris?
Yeah, so I recognize that shortcoming as well. I mean, there's only so much we can do as a municipality. And we also don't have, an army of enforcement officers to patrol every corner of the internet, or even Craigslist here. So this is in a lot of ways the first step, but I think it's also part of a sort of broader education campaign, like this article, as people sort of start to understand what these things are. I'll also point out that what Jessica has done here in this ordinance is create a chapter in our code where we could pretty easily slide in more species as needed. If there was some species that we recognized was detrimental in this environment, but the state hadn't yet acted, we could slide more species in here. I have a question for Bill Falsey or for Jessica about the result in a fine of $250, sort of how that's calculated, I guess I should say. So if you have 3 plants, is that 3 $250 fines? If you offer the plant for sale and we catch you and fine you, and then you're a retailer and you're offering it again in a week, it's the same plant. How does that work exactly?
Through the chair, I think that would be largely left to the discretion of code enforcement. So the general fine schedule has that level of flexibility where if you were to go to Home Depot and they were engaging in sales, Jack Frost would most likely issue you 1 citation, and that would cover it. But if it came back 2 weeks later and you're still doing it, he could issue another citation. It's not a requirement that you would have to issue a citation for each and every sale.
And is this penalty section sort of a standard construction of how we do these kind of fines?
Yeah, through the chair, if you were to open Title 14 of our code, there is a very large table that lists just about every fine that can be levied in a municipality.
Okay.
Mr. Peterson and Mr. Gates.
Go ahead. I just wanted to address that question. What would prevent someone from buying plants in Nancy or Oregon down around? I think the language we have right now just says sell, but we could further expand that. Some words would be to say sell, transfer, distribute, buy, plant, install, and then buy new species. And that, I think, can stop any sort of statute is. So just a little wordsmithing, I think, would address that concern when they meet from that sewer online.
Can I answer that?
Go ahead.
So just to answer Dean's question and for my colleagues, Jessica originally wrote it in exactly that way, as Dean suggested, and or something similar to that was quite broad. And I asked them to sort of narrow it to just sell, because I didn't want a vision of like war on drugs style raids and like code enforcement officers going on the private property, and I just didn't want people to get that in their mindset. So I admit that probably as a policy matter might be where we want to go eventually, but sort of a political matter, I wanted to start with something a little more modest. That's my only answer for it.
Mr. Peterson?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as far as the fine is concerned, we could add, a double fine for second offense, a triple fine for third offense, or something along that line, so that we create some sort of deterrent, so that once they were caught, they would realize the next time it's going to get a little more spendy for you. So that's something we might also want to consider.
We use that numerous times for other words.
You bet.
Chris?
Yeah, I might suggest, I know this is just enabling or the whereas stuff, but we add, because what I heard from Josh was that this is kind of part of a broader approach or discussion that's ongoing. A previous whereas, it says whereas these invasive species are causing problems, and if somebody recognizes that we have to take a broader approach and we'll develop over time policies to address that, then move into the specific, which is this ordinance.
I think that's a great idea. I'll do that. This isn't even introduced yet, so I can change that.
Okay.
No whereas.
Other questions from Assembly members? We do have time for our participation. Is there anything the audience wants to add to this? We're here.
Chair, members of the Assembly, my name is Jim Rankert. I'm the program director for the Alaska Department of Natural Resources Division of Forestry, Urban Community Forestry Program. And to go to Mr. Constance's question, how much money is going into this, there is a landscape scale restoration grant that the state's applied for a couple years ago, received. It is going through the Anchorage Park Foundation, and part of the grant is on Campbell Creek. The name of the project is Fish Need a Forest. There's been YEP crews out there the last 2 days, or actually this past week, putting in elevated light penetrating walkways just in time for the kids' salmon fishery tomorrow.
Which is this weekend.
Yep, it's tomorrow. But included in the grants, among other things, was $7,000 for Mr. Pattis eradication efforts or control efforts. It's going to take a while to eradicate it. So there is some federal money coming through the state, through the Park Foundation, to address some of the Pattis.
Through a process where we can identify known people that confess they've got a chokecherry tree in their backyard, that we can put a fine on them or have them on down. The birds land there and distribute it everywhere.
Gone for free, make it criminal.
Thank you. Any other questions from Assembly members? Anybody else who wants to say anything from the public?
Yeah, my name is Frank Wardney, and I've got the property at Hope, about 35 acres of buffers between the town and the river. And my neighbor's got some 35-year-old chokecherries, bird cherries, and I've spent many days pulling them off of my property. And these trees, like Mr. Weldon, produce hundreds and hundreds of berries, and you just transport them all over the town. We've got a pretty good neighborhood eradication program going on. We started last summer, and according to Tim Stallard, we can get it back to zero. But in an Anchorage, you're just dealing out with containment to keep it out of Chokecherry Park. So, I mean, especially in John's case, which is your tree.
That'll be hard for me to do because I really like the way it separates me from my neighbors. But if you go to Independence Park, that road was rebuilt, I think, within the last 5 or 6 years. I've been
Is it federal dollars or state dollars?
I don't know, but it is lined with Chokecherry. And I was
Yeah.
aware of these so recently. It is lined with them, maybe whatever they are, the same kind of trees.
Municipality put in those
Elmore
borders.
has them. I mean, if you, on my way here, I probably passed 500 of those trees.
Yeah, but once you know better, it's your responsibility to do something. And I'm speaking as a guy because honestly, I've got a lot of other projects and things that we like to do with my summertime, right? Eradicating maybe.
My neighbors will have to look at my dad. Can I
Well,
do that to them?
You know, and there is I wish Tim were here because there are programs where somebody will take it. You can have another ornamental tree to replace that. It's not.
40 foot?
Pardon?
40-foot tree?
Yeah.
Mountain ash trees.
Well, you gotta give it a little time to grow.
So thank you, sir.
Of course, one place that I noticed these things, we might find a place for in here is homeowners associations, condo associations, folks who are developers tend to include requirements to plant these plants specifically in their developments. And I can show you a number of these over the last couple of years where I've identified them. Why are you doing this? And so there is an area of discussion that might actually be one of the more primary offenders.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. I mean, for Chris, I was actually thinking about this big development about to do on Tudor. Are they planning to plant these, these invasive species as they're, to separate from the road?
Through the chair, Mr. Dunbar, I don't have any idea what they plan to plant, what type of species. They have not procured a landscape architect at this time. They've laid out where trees probably will go on the site plan, but even that is still at a preliminary stage. However, considering that I'm part of this discussion, and I thought Robin was in here too, we will certainly pass that along to them, that this will be, in fact, we'll figure out if we can put it in the development agreement, that this will be a chokecherry, Mayday, birdcherry free development.
Yeah, I guess that's the
Name
question.
that for us, would you please?
Absolutely.
I guess that's the question, Chris, we can talk about this afterwards, but the question for me to talk with legal about as well is how, would we need a separate ordinance, or is there a way to do it here as well to get language about homeowner associations or large-scale developments to go forward to make sure that we kind of at least stop things that going forward from requiring this or putting this in?
And I think it's just Title 21 element that we have to have in language that says these plants are not allowed. And if we're gonna go ahead and ban them at some point, then we can do that. But I think it's in Title 21 that you'll find that that's, I know this isn't 15, but in Title 21, that's where you have all of the planting requirements. You have to have this plant and that plant, not specifics.
Through the chair, Mr. Thompson, to the extent that Title 21 has landscape requirements, it does not specify species. And so somebody who interpreted the landscaping requirements to mean that they should be putting in chokecherries is incorrect.
But that is a good point, though. We could, I'm not comfortable going as far as to say that this is a banned species under going forward for new development.
Right, and that to me seems like the place where the developers go to get their advice on what to put in, not the specific plants, but.
Through the chair, Mr. Concept, that's also not correct. This is that you're required to work through a landscape architect, and landscape architects, trust me, are going to be very aware of this. And I'm just worried that it'll be duplicative. I understand and appreciate the intent, and I think that's a good intent, but I do think that this ordinance can accomplish that without leaving something.
Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see Robin right there, and so would it be possible to communicate with condo associations? There's only a handful of management companies that run most of the condo associations. So could we get the word out to them that this is not the preferred plant for them, to be planting or whatever?
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
And cut soon, so.
Anything else from the city members? Anything else from the public? If not, this workshop is over with. Next one starts at 2:30. It shall be.